everyone, and welcome to another episode of Art Discourse. Today I am very privileged and honored to have our dear guest, Nicolas Krusek, again here for the second time, the first ever in our Art Discourse. Nicolas is a master's in musicology. He's also very well versed in the world of literature, and anything about art and that kind of stuff, especially with the objectivist approach to things. So, Nicolas, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Onatan.
Now, there's a very particular reason I'm having Nicolas here. This time, Nicolas is going to be giving a very exciting talk at the upcoming Objectivist conference in Anaheim, California. The conference is also known as OCON. The talk is going to be about a very unique work of art that we touched very briefly on the last episode of Art Discourse with Dr. Drang, which is Goethe's Faust. Now, most of our viewers probably don't have no clue what that is because they're probably Americans. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but Nicolas, why don't you give us a bit of background? First of all, why, and are you giving a talk on Faust? Or perhaps first, what is Faust, and then why are you giving a talk on it?
All right. Well, I'll explain a little bit of the motivation for this talk. And this is, in a way, it's related to the talk that I gave last year, which we can also talk about a little bit. So definitely in aesthetics, in the appreciation of art, Romanticism is very central to those of us within the Objectivist movement. Many of us have read the Romantic Manifesto at least once. We know that Ayn Rand herself regarded herself as a romantic realist. And in particular, there's a lot of emphasis within the movement on the French and the Russian romantics. So in literature, for example, Victor Hugo, Dostoevsky, and there's, I think, some appreciation for the playwright Friedrich Schiller, who of course was a close friend and colleague of Goethe's. But in general, I think there hasn't been enough emphasis or enough exploration of German Romanticism. And that's very important because if there was no German Romanticism, there would have been no romantic movement as such. The Germans, in a way, invented the whole idea of Romanticism in aesthetics and also in philosophy as well. And Goethe played a central role in that. He was, in a way, one of the founding fathers of the Romanticism, and particularly this movement that came to prominence in the 1770s in German, known as Sturm und Drang. And I think you talked a little bit about the Sturm und Drang in your discussion with Deborah last time. But the way I think of Sturm und Drang is it was the rebellious adolescent phase of Romanticism, where they were casting off old artistic forms, old constraints of morality and ethics, and trying to forge a new path based on an Enlightenment sensibility or an Enlightenment sense of life. And Goethe definitely played a very important role in that, and his Faust as well, which we can discuss in more detail.
Absolutely. As we discussed, Werther, the Sorrows of Young Werther, is the probably the most important piece of literature of this Sturm und Drang period. Right, Nicolas? Perhaps we need just a bit of information about that so we can understand what Faust really is about.
Yeah, good point. So the interesting thing about Goethe, so he was born in 1749, and at the age of 24, he became a German celebrity with his first play entitled Goethe von Berlichingen. It's not a play that's widely known today, although it's actually a splendid play. I've read it and I recommend it to our viewers who are interested in drama. And I think if you like Schiller's play, you would probably like this play as well. And then a year later, at the age of 25, Goethe became an international celebrity with his first novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. You discussed this novel at length in your discussion with Deborah, so I won't go into details now, but it was hugely influential. Every young man read it. There were a lot of stories. I can't remember if this came up in your last discussion, but there were stories that a lot of young men in Germany and France at that time committed suicide, and they were found with copies of The Sorrows of Young Werther in their pockets. You know, either they drowned themselves or shot themselves, and they had a copy of the book. That's how famous, that's how popular the book was. And then,
Yeah.
as if that wasn't enough, a year after that, Goethe was invited to Weimar by the Duke to become a close personal advisor and administrator. So Goethe wasn't just Germany's greatest poet and playwright and novelist. He was also a statesman. He held various official capacities, inspector of mines. He was a rector at the university. He's been, I think, quite justifiably described as the last Renaissance man. He was a man who had all these different interests. He was also a scientist. He did original work in many different scientific fields. Now, you asked me specifically about the Sturm und Drang, and this was really the movement that, at least in Germany, it swept away the influence of French neoclassicism. You know, like the neoclassical dramas of people like Corneille, Molière, Racine. And in a way, the Sturm und Drang actually harkened back to the influence of Shakespeare. And this is something that I think is underappreciated, particularly by people within the Objectivist movement, that Shakespeare was seen by the Romantics as one of their own because his plays are very colorful and they project very strong emotions. And you can definitely see the influence of Shakespeare on a play like Goethe's Goethe von Berlichingen, but also some of the early plays of Schiller, which are also seen as falling under this umbrella of Sturm und Drang. So, for example, The Robbers was Schiller's first play. There's definitely lots of echoes there of Richard III and King Lear, and even in Schiller's second and third plays, like Fiesco or The Genoese Conspiracy or Intrigue in Love, there's still that sort of Elizabethan English influence and also a very strong influence from Goethe himself.
So the Sturm und Drang was something to grow up from. It was not sustainable as a movement because it was so emotionally intense, and it was appropriate for somebody in his early 20s, but not for a grown man. It would have been way too much, right? And that's where the later works of Goethe come into play, and that's where Romanticism is emerging from this earlier period of Sturm und Drang, correct?
Absolutely correct. And by the end of the 1770s, Goethe himself definitely felt that he'd outgrown the Sturm und Drang. He looked back on his early plays and novels as, something that he would have wanted to rather set aside. And the interesting point is that initially Goethe actually had a negative impression of Schiller. And the reason was because Schiller was a decade younger than Goethe, and he was writing Sturm und Drang plays in the 1780s. And Goethe's attitude was, who is this kid trying to resurrect this immature artistic movement? And it was only until many, many years later when Goethe discovered that Schiller himself had matured and moved beyond the Sturm und Drang that they became close colleagues and friends and collaborators. I think an important turning point for Goethe was his interest in classical antiquity, in Greco-Roman culture. A particularly crucial period in his life came in the mid to late 1780s, where he actually embarked on a 2-year tour of Italy, where he visited Rome, he visited Florence and Naples, all the major Italian cities. He immersed himself in the art, the architecture. I think he even took painting lessons. He learned a little bit about art firsthand, admired all the sculpture there, immersed himself in the literature and the mythology of ancient Greece. And this had definite influences on some of his plays that he was working on then. Like, for example, his play Iphigenia in Taurus. That's one of his mature plays. And it's a story that's actually set in ancient Greek mythology. Iphigenia was the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. It's set during the time of the Trojan War. And definitely Goethe's absorption in classical antiquity had a strong influence on the eventual development of Faust as well, particularly the second part of Faust.
Yeah, so we will get to that, I hope, in a bit. So there's this thing about Goethe, that he was a universal genius, probably one of the last ones to ever live. Another thing, you mentioned Italy. I remember reading that when he was like 70 or something, he studied Farsi. He wanted to learn Farsi, and he had an admiration for this Farsi poet. I forgot the name, but he was very interested in all sorts of things from a variety. He was a scientist. He wrote a book about color theory, which for a long while was considered the best work on color theory until better science emerged on that. So I think this interest with universal subjects is what led rise to Faust, because Faust was also is about universal issues from a variety of different subjects. It covers a lot of different themes. And I think that also touches on why it's still relevant, because we are here talking about, our viewers might wonder, we're talking about art from 200, 250 years ago. How is it relevant to our lives? Things are so much different now. How are these universal themes of Goethe relevant today, Nicolas?
First of all, I think Goethe as a cultural figure is still relevant today. You mentioned that he was one of the last universal geniuses, and I think that's very much true. And it was, I think, at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, it was still possible for one man to contain within himself almost all knowledge accumulated at the time in the arts, in the sciences, politics, statecraft. And so Goethe, in many ways, was one of the most extraordinary human beings of the time, and he was acknowledged as such, even by Napoleon. There's the famous story about the time Napoleon first met Goethe, and his reaction was, "Voila un homme," at last a man. And all of Goethe's interests go into Faust. So let me talk a little bit about how Faust came about. So Goethe began working on the story of Faust during his Sturm und Drang period. And I think a little bit of that rebelliousness, the iconoclasm of the Sturm und Drang finds its way into Faust. So Faust he's a scholar. He's a scholar who is in his 50s. He's bored with the limitations of human knowledge. He's in the late Middle Ages. He's studied all the branches of learning, philosophy, jurisprudence, medicine, theology. He's absolutely bored with it. He thinks everything he's teaching his students is absolute nonsense. And this was in the Middle Ages. You can understand where he's coming from. And so what he wants is to gain experience of the world. He wants to regain his lost youth and vitality. He wants to go out into the world, get out of his laboratory, get out of the classroom, and go out into the world and just experience things. Experience romance for the first time. Experience politics. At one point, he ends up at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. He wants to experience the culture of ancient Greece in person. And significantly, in part 2 of Faust, Goethe actually takes his hero back to ancient Greece, where he meets various historical and mythological figures, and where he learns firsthand about ancient Greek pedagogy and science and the whole ancient Greek worldview. Then he becomes involved in warfare and empire building. So all of the interests that Goethe himself had as a man, all the various facets, they all find their way, they all find a certain expression in the character of Faust himself. I wouldn't quite go so far as to say that Faust is an autobiographical projection of the author. Maybe in the sense that Kira Argonova is a kind of an autobiographical projection of Ayn Rand, her views, her convictions, we could say in a very loose sort of way. But so we have, Faust is really the greatest work by one of the most extraordinary human beings in recent European history. And I think just on those grounds alone, it's something that's worth attention. And one last point I want to make, because I want to tie this into my OCON talk from last year. Of course, another very important universal genius, and someone who was influenced by Goethe later in the 19th century, was Richard Wagner, who wasn't just a musician and composer. He was also a poet, a dramatist, a philosopher. An original philosopher. He read philosophy. He wrote about philosophy. And in his own way, within his own sphere, he was also a kind of a universal genius. And again, because within the Objectivist movement, there's a kind of a focus on Russian Romanticism, French Romanticism. He is a figure who I think has been somewhat neglected, which was why I chose him as the subject for my talk last year. So in a way, I kind of think of this talk as kind of like a prequel, or perhaps you could say like a prequel to my talk from last year, in that I'm trying to bring German Romanticism in all its different aspects and facets to life as much as possible.
So next talk gotta be about Caspar David Friedrich. If we're talking about
No, that's your job. You're the expert on painting here. You need to give a talk on Caspar David Friedrich.
you know, by the way, he was friends with Goethe as well, Caspar David Friedrich. I don't know if you've known about that, but they met in Dresden towards the end of Goethe's life, and they were well acquainted. But yeah, I think it's fantastic the work you're doing. I really recommend the Wagner talk. I'm going to put the link in the description for our viewers if you still haven't seen it. It's one of the best OCON talks I've ever been to, and that says a lot because there are so many great talks at OCON. And I think you're doing kind of a service to the objectivist community by exposing it to this amazing world of art, literature, that they are, you know, because Rand wrote about what she wrote, it gets less of an attention. That's a good thing that I think you are shedding some light on. Now, if we're going to go back to Faust, the impact that Faust had on the world, would you say that it was as big as the impact that Goethe had with a previous work, such as Werther? We talked about the international acclaim it got for him. What did Faust bring Goethe?
Well, there's certainly much we can say about that. And the interesting thing is that all of Goethe's major works had a huge cultural impact. We've already talked about the Sorrows of Young Werther, which became hugely popular, read by everybody, not just in Germany, but throughout Europe in the 1770s and on into the 1780s. And I have to give a shout out to one other novel by Goethe, which dates from the late 1790s, and that's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, which actually introduces one of Goethe's most iconic characters, a young person named Mignon, whom, if you like, we can talk a little bit more about Mignon later on. But this was a novel that a famous German poet and philosopher, Schlegel, said that the influence of Wilhelm Meister on German culture was comparable to that of the French Revolution. That's a pretty bold statement. And I would say even more so than the Sorrows of Young Werther, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship was one of these books that throughout the 19th century was read by everybody, influenced lots of visual artists, composers, musicians, and that's certainly true of Faust as well. So the first part of Faust was ultimately published in two parts, although I would argue that the two parts are very intimately connected. Part one of Faust was published in 1808, and by then Goethe had worked on it for 30 some odd years. He published a fragment of what would eventually become part one in 1790, but the definitive part one was published in 1808. Immediately was translated into many languages. Notably, there was the French translation by Gérard de Nerval, which influenced the cantata by Hector Berlioz, very important French romantic composer, and later on also the opera by Charles Gounod, which probably some people in the audience might be familiar with the French operatic version of Faust. It was also translated into Russian and Italian and many other European languages. And it very rapidly became a kind of an iconic cultural phenomenon. Now, Goethe worked on the second and final part of Faust in the last years of his life. He died in 1832. He completed the second part of Faust some months before his death, but he didn't publish it right away. He set it aside, tied it up neatly with instructions that it should be published after his death. Apparently, he didn't want to be pestered with all the questions of, the interpretation and the meaning, and so he wanted to just set it aside and let it be published after he was gone. So he died in 1832. Faust Part 2 was published some months later. And I have to say, Part 2 is much more challenging. It's more challenging to read. It's longer, it's denser, but nonetheless very, very important, but it raises certain interpretive challenges. I would say that in terms of the influence of Faust on the other arts, on the visual arts, on music, and ultimately on cinema, probably the first part has always been more better known, more widely read, more influential. And also the first part of Faust tends to be staged more frequently. I mean, it was staged many, many times in the 19th century. The second part of Faust, because of its immense length, it's, I think, almost 3 times as long as Faust Part 1. It's not very often staged. Although I think you and I last time we chatted, we talked about the staging with the actor Bruno Ganz, the famous Swiss actor.
Yeah, the 4-hour staging.
First part.
I watched as much as I could. It's rather tough, but I watched I think about 50% of it. It's really really long. But I absolutely recommend. He's a wonderful actor. Should probably go back to it. There are lots of interesting staging of Faust. I also recommend there's an audiobook version, 4 hour long, which is it's more condensed, and it's like a performance audiobook. So you have different characters playing different roles. It's interesting. I recommend it. About perhaps we should give a bit of like what is the story about, just in headlines, so the viewers can get a better sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so the story of Faust was not original with Goethe. It actually goes back 200 some odd years before his own time. And there is a kind of a historical basis, which I'll touch on in my OCON talk. There were various literary adaptations, the most important being the play by Christopher Marlowe, who was an Elizabethan playwright, an exact contemporary of William Shakespeare. And Christopher Marlowe's play about Dr. Faust is actually an excellent play, even though it's very, very different from Goethe's. The original idea behind Faust was that it's a scholar who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and power and pleasure. Not necessarily in that order. And so there's definitely, in the original Faust story, has a very strong moralizing element to it, that here's this evildoer, this who turns away from God, who consorts with dark forces. You know, he exhibits hubris. He's like a kind of an Icarus who tries to soar above the rest of mankind, perishes on his waxen wings. There's that element to it. And who in the end meets, deservedly, eternal damnation. That is not what Goethe does with the story. Goethe actually presents his protagonist in a much more sympathetic light. Yes, he's still a scholar who's frustrated with the limitations of human knowledge, but I think Goethe shows Faust as being much more aware of his own motivation. He introspects, he understands what's lacking in his life and what he wants to achieve. And he's actually presented as, in many ways, succeeding. So he decides he doesn't want any more book learning. He's studied his whole life. He wants to go out and experience life, which he does. And he wants to become a creative individual. He wants to find something where he can leave his permanent mark on human society and human civilization, which I don't want to give too many spoilers at this point, but it's the way I would summarize the difference between Goethe's Faust and the original treatment of the legend is that the original Faust story is about a man who sells his soul. Goethe's Faust is about a man who finds his soul, albeit with the devil's help, but still, he's presented as a much more virtuous individual, a much more ambitious individual. And I think that's very important to our understanding of what Goethe saw, the potential that he saw in this story.
Mm-hmm. And from the outset, our viewers can probably tell that there is an assumed dichotomy here from this story, that it's either you're a scholar who sits all day and reads books, or you go out and experience life. And if we are good students of objectivism, we know that it's a false dichotomy. Does Goethe agree with that dichotomy, the way he presents the story, Nicolas?
I think he does. And I say this on the basis not only of the evidence in Faust itself, but what I know more generally about Goethe. So there's an interesting phrase which in part 1 of Faust is actually put into the mouth of Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles is the devil who tempts Faust. And he says, he's talking to a young student, and Mephistopheles says, "Gray, dear friend, is every theory, and green alone life's golden tree." Meaning that learning, book learning, knowledge, it's dry, it's dead. It's not, what's alive is experience, is actual life. And I think that's a theme that comes up again and again in Goethe. So, and actually this brings me to an interesting point, which is the comparison between Goethe and Schiller. Because Schiller was a much more philosophical thinker than Goethe was. I mean, Schiller read Kant. He was strongly influenced by Kant. We know that Goethe also read a little bit of Kant, but the whole business of speculative philosophy was not something that really appealed to him. He saw
because he was a poet, I think.
Well, of course, he was much more than a poet. Now, I do think that Goethe, in his scientific work, was influenced by some Kantian ideas. Like, for example, in his work on optics and colors, which you mentioned earlier. But in his poetry, I think in many ways he's kind of an anti-Kantian, or at least he's very, very different, very, very far removed. Whereas Schiller was more of a Kantian, and not surprisingly, Schiller was more of a moralist. Like the whole idea of the altruism and the Christian ethics comes through much more strongly in Schiller's works. It's virtually absent in a lot of Goethe's work, and I think particularly Faust, I think refreshingly free from the whole odor of Christian and altruist moralizing.
It's a bit more secular, Goethe in his work. Would you agree?
Well, even though Goethe would have been raised as a Protestant, I think his interests go well beyond Lutheranism. So, for example, I mean, Goethe's favorite philosopher, I think the philosopher who influenced him the most was Spinoza. In many ways, Goethe was a Spinozist. He was keenly interested in pantheism. That particularly comes through in the second part of Faust. He was also, this shouldn't come as a surprise given his interest in ancient Greek culture. He was also quite interested in paganism, including, the Orphic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece.
And Orientalism as well.
And Orientalism. So there was a collection. He published some collections of poetry inspired by like the West Eastern Divan. That was one of Goethe's really popular collections of poetry. Yeah, and even in the last decade or so of his life, he was interested in Oriental literature, Oriental languages. So he really was an all-embracing kind of figure. And the last point that I'll make in terms of the comparison between Goethe and Schiller, there was a very influential treatise by Schiller in which he called On Naive and Sentimental Poetry. And it was kind of a comparison of ancient Greek poetry with contemporary German poetry. I think there's definitely a sense in which Schiller identified Goethe with the naive, the sort of non-intellectual, non-reflective culture of ancient Greece, whereas Schiller saw himself as kind of a modern, sentimental, reflective, philosophical figure.
Very interesting. and going back to the reason emotion thing, it's interesting because Ayn Rand identified Romanticism. So Ayn Rand identified the way conventional philosophers, art historians identify Romanticism as basically choosing emotion in the reason-emotion dichotomy. So this is the emotionalist side, and the other ones are neoclassicists, for example.
And that's the conventional view that you're talking about.
Exactly, and you're saying that Goethe pretty much agreed with that dichotomy, and Faust is taking the emotion side in this emotion-reason dichotomy.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that, because after Goethe matured from his Sturm und Drang period, then he went into kind of a classicist phase, or a kind of a neoclassicist phase. That's the period of some of his plays like Torquato Tasso, Iphigenia in Taurus. But ultimately, as Goethe approached his full maturity, the period in which Faust Part 1 was published, his novel, The Elective Affinities, which another great novel by Goethe that I highly recommend, and then eventually moving into Faust Part 2, Goethe seemed to be moving towards a kind of a reconciliation of classicism and romanticism. So I think what we actually find in Faust, if we consider the two parts of Faust together, is I think there's an interaction, mostly harmonious interaction between the emotional elements. And I think Faust projects very strong emotions. It's a very exciting, very colorful work. but there's also a strong intellectual element, even though Faust kind of professes to repudiate intellectualism, and at one point he says, I loathe the knowledge I once sought, but he's a very intelligent and very aware, very self-aware individual, who introspects and who strives to understand what's going on around him.
So that really brings, I think, us to the resolution, to choice. Ayn Rand identified volition as the fundamental thing about Romanticism, and I think there is a lot in Faust to support that theory. I think a lot of Faust is about choice. The fundamental choice from the outset is Faust's choice to cut a deal with Mephistopheles, and we see all the consequences. We see the causal relationship between the decision and what's happening, and without giving spoilers, we can see how possibly salvation is possible because of the choice. You can still make choices. There is free will. There is no determinism in Faust. What would you say about that?
Here, I think it can be useful to draw a comparison between Goethe's Faust and the earlier versions of the legend, like, for example, Christopher Marlowe's play or some of the other dramatic or prose versions of the Faust legend. The earlier Faust was essentially a hedonist. He wants pleasure, he wants power, and why does he want them? Well, he wants them just because he wants them. He's a hedonist, but he doesn't really introspect. He doesn't know his own motivations. What makes Goethe's Faust a really good specimen of Rand's view of Romanticism, which is the focus on volition and choice, is that he's a man who really knows what he wants and why he wants it. And no, that's not to say that he begins by knowing everything, but he introspects. He has these, Faust Part 1 begins with these long monologues for the character, and then when he actually meets Mephistopheles, there are these long dialogues where he explains his own feelings and thoughts and motivations. He's definitely a man who reflects on his own existential and psychological situation. And once he arrives at a decision, once he makes a choice, he sticks with it over the long term. And I think this is the crucial thing. And this is one of the things that I'm going to be stressing in my talk, is that very early on in his relationship with Mephistopheles, Faust makes a choice. He says, I'm going to experience everything, all that is the lot of humankind, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. And he persists in this against all possible temptations, all possible obstacles. He has a long-range goal which he follows over a period of actually decades. His relationship with Mephistopheles, it expands over a very, very long lifespan. And so he proves to be a man of considerable determination, resilience, and that's, I think, really where this aspect of volition comes through most clearly.
And it can always change. It's always possible for him. There's no this sense of it's it's the laws of nature that dictated him to be like that. He made the decision and he sticks by that. But he can always reverse it.
No determinism. There's no determinism in Goethe's Faust. There's no sense that his path is preordained. He responds to his experiences, and sometimes he may be deflected in one direction or another, but still that long-range goal is always in front of him.
This leads us to another aspect of Romanticism that is also conventional thinkers agree is the Sublime. Sublime is perhaps, Nicolas, you can say a bit. How do you view the Sublime? And then the relationship to Faust and other.
The Sublime, the idea of the Sublime is something that was widely discussed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. One of the most important books on the subject is the book by Edmund Burke, who is an English philosopher, on the beautiful and the sublime. And he's the two, and who later on he also influenced some of Kant's writings and the Critique of Judgment. Schiller also wrote about the beautiful and the sublime, and so those two ideas are very often compared and contrasted. The idea is that the beautiful includes things that are small, easily comprehensible, easy to enjoy, whereas the sublime is something that just overwhelms you. So, for example, you've written a lot and you've talked a lot about landscape paintings. And when you stand in front of one of these massive landscape paintings, it just overwhelms you. You really get the sense of the sheer raw power of nature. You know, you're standing in front of a Caspar David Friedrich painting with the sea of ice or some gigantic mountain landscape. The whole idea of the sublime is that it overwhelms you. It conjures up images of terror, but at a remove, because you're either reading a poem or looking at a painting. So there's no actual existential danger, but it gives you the experience of danger. It gives you the experience of being overwhelmed by something in nature. One good musical example of the sublime is the music of Beethoven. Right? Beethoven was a composer whose music really, it grabs you by the throat and it overwhelms you with the sheer torrents of sound, the sheer intensity of his orchestral writing.
Which connects to Schiller in the Ninth
Yeah,
Symphony. Mm-hmm.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So where the sublime comes in Faust is, particularly in the second part of Faust, because in the second part of Faust, Goethe wanted to put in everything, everything to do with human experience, all of human knowledge, all of human science and art and culture. He takes his heroes back to ancient Greece, to the classical Walpurgisnacht. Everything that a human being can experience, he tries to put into part two. And that's one of the reasons that makes part two very dense and challenging, because of this sublime aspect, that it contains everything that Goethe wanted to say as a poet and as a thinker.
And I think there is an interesting parallel to be made to a novel like Atlas Shrugged, because Atlas Shrugged is also about everything. It touches on all issues, and in this sense, Rand is a pretty similar type of writer to get. Not a lot of writers write about this many ideas in just one work, and there's also sublime in that. Yeah.
Well, Victor Hugo would have been the most obvious inspiration there. His Les Miserables, I think, is also a work of sublimity, and that it shows this whole panoramic view of French society from the period before the Battle of Waterloo up to the Revolution, the 1830s, showing characters from all different classes, all different stratas of society. So I think that's the most obvious parallel that we can draw.
Yeah, I'm talking about like to our times. I'm talking about great works that we, as fans of Ayn Rand, we can see like as kind of motivation for the viewers to go check out Faust. Is if we like this type of work like Atlas that touches on everything, it has a lot of that in Faust. That's the point I was trying to make. And I was thinking, taking just a thought for our writers, perhaps in the audience. I'm interested, like Goethe took some of his heroes to ancient Greece. Imagine taking them to Galt's Gulch. Imagine taking Faust and having a dialogue with John Galt or Francisco Denker. I think it would be very interesting type of dialogue to write, if anyone wants to take on the offer. Yeah.
I can't even speculate on what that would look like.
It'll be interesting, I think. Okay, so the sublime, like, there's, I think, also sublime in a smaller things. Like, it's also about just what we really long for, what we really aspire towards. What is our ideal? Like, we think about amazing places we want to live, we want to travel to. I think there is also sublime in this aspiration to do greater things than we currently do. We aspire something to aspire towards. So, in a sense, I think even like I'm talking about paintings, for example, if we have like a more of a naturalistic painting, like the ones I wrote in my latest essay about the Brabizon school of French painters, who are just French painters, went out to the forest just to paint the trees, the beautiful lakes, and that kind of stuff. Do you think there is sublime to be found in this kind of mundane type of landscape, or just activity to go and sit by nature and paint some paintings on the open field? Do you think there's sublime there?
I tend to associate the sublime with things that are not mundane. At least I think that's the way the sublime was understood by people in the late 18th, early 19th century who wrote on the subject. People like we've mentioned Burke and Kant and Schiller. They tended to associate the everyday, the ordinary with not necessarily with the beautiful, which is a separate category, but I think the sublime was understood as something extraordinary, something rare, like a storm at sea or a raging cataract or a waterfall or something massive, something that really overwhelms you when you experience it. So I
Is it
think
so?
the paintings that you talked about where it showed for example, the women in the field or
Yeah,
something like
yeah.
that, I wouldn't necessarily associate that with the sublime.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking like trying to apply it to our lives now. We read about these great works of literature. Where can we go in our life to look for it and experience it first-handed? Where can we go? Like I remember driving through the Alps in Switzerland, and just saying, "Oh wow, that's like sublime." The beauty. Like, where do you have examples for where we can find it? As I think also going to a great concert, right? Going to a Wagner opera. Where else can we find that?
Well, it depends what you're interested in. If nature is what you like, I'm sure people would typically describe something like Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon as sublime, as nature at its vastest, at its most all-embracing. Artistic experiences, yeah, that's for many of us. That's where we encounter the sublime most notably, whether it's a really moving operatic or concert experience, or going to an art gallery or a museum and seeing one of these vast paintings, one of these landscape paintings, which you've written about so eloquently. And literature as well. Literature can be a great source of the sublime. So we've talked about Faust.
Hmm.
I think there are definitely some plays by Schiller which fit under this category as well. For example, Schiller wrote this trilogy of plays called Wallenstein. It's set during the period of the 30 Years' War in
Hmm.
Europe and Central Europe, and it's Schiller's longest play. And it's one of these panoramic views showing characters from different strata of society, and set against this really detailed and rich historical background. I think we can certainly find the sublime in some of the great plays by Henrik Ibsen, for example,
Mm.
who is well known to our community through Dr. Peacock's Eight Great Plays course, right? He talks about the enemy of the people, but
Right,
some of his
and there was a
other
great
plays are really.
performance of that recently by Mark Pellegrino.
Was that in
Re-
Austin, Texas?
I think so. We've had Anne from the Austin Shakespeare theater company, which we touched on that. So yeah, that's right. And there's also an interesting Hegelian connect to Ibsen, but I think that's too complicated to bring Hegel, isn't it? Um,
Hegel is always too complicated,
yeah.
but interesting.
Nevertheless, yes. Perhaps we can go a bit further in time to someone like Nietzsche.
Okay.
Um, for for yeah. For example, just one anecdote, like Nietzsche's relationship with Wagner, um, and you can extrapolate on that.
Well, so Nietzsche had an interesting connection to both Goethe and Wagner. For one thing, Nietzsche was one of Goethe's great admirers. He regarded Goethe as one of the last great Germans, one of the last great thinkers. And if you read his works, if you read Nietzsche's works, he quotes or paraphrases from Faust all the time. Faust comes up again and again in Nietzsche's writings. Oh, so you asked about his relationship with Wagner. So this is a very interesting story. Nietzsche met Wagner in 1868, and now Nietzsche was 31 years younger than Wagner, so Wagner would have been 55 at the time. Nietzsche would have been only 24. And bear in mind that in 1868, Wagner was Germany's most famous, I mean, you could say infamous composers. He was celebrated, feted across Europe. He was hobnobbing with heads of state. Nietzsche at the time was completely unknown. He was a short, nearsighted, soft-spoken, slightly nerdy professor of philology at Basel University, and nobody knew. And Wagner was really the one celebrity, the one really, really famous, really great man that Nietzsche actually knew in his life. What really united them was their at the time shared enthusiasm for the philosophy of Schopenhauer, who actually had quite a notable influence on many of Wagner's operas. Tristan and Isolde, the Master Singers, and Parsifal most notably. Well, and the Ring of the Nibelung as well. Nietzsche started off as a Schopenhauerian. He read Schopenhauer widely, but as Nietzsche began to mature and as he began to develop his own views, he gradually moved away from Schopenhauer's ideas. His later writings, he's actually quite critical of Schopenhauer, and that's probably connected with why Nietzsche eventually drifted away from Wagner, why their friendship eventually soured. And so by the time we get to 1876, which was the year of the first complete Ring cycle, the first complete performance of Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen in the Bavarian town of Bayreuth, by that time Nietzsche was virtually sick of Wagner and was moving away from him. And of course, after Wagner's death, in 1883, Nietzsche published a lot of very nasty things about his erstwhile friend and mentor. So it's a story of two great men who had common intellectual ground, but then later on discovered that actually they were moving apart in terms of their interests and their focus. And Nietzsche in particular said a lot of very unkind things about Wagner in his later writing. And some of the things that he said about Wagner are correct and astute, but sometimes one gets the impression he's being a little bit disingenuous as well.
I think one of the things Nietzsche had, correct me if I'm wrong, Nicolas, is that Wagner was very, Germanic nationalist, and Nietzsche was more into the French world. Is that something to do with it?
So this is interesting because in the early 20th centuries, there were a lot of misconceptions in the Anglo-American academic world associating Nietzsche with Nazism and with German nationalism, because apparently Hitler admired Nietzsche. Hitler had a bust of Nietzsche in his study. When Hitler met Mussolini, he gave him an edition of the complete works of Nietzsche. So there's all these anecdotes linking Nietzsche with Nazism. First of all, Nietzsche died in 1900, so 33 years before Hitler and the Nazis were elected to power. And there are some similarities between Nietzsche's ideas and Nazism, but there are also some striking differences in some respects in which they're opposite, in which they're very, very different. But the whole question of German nationalism and how this ties into Wagner, in Nietzsche's mature writings, he's actually very anti-Germanic. He actually talks a lot about how, at one point, he even says that the Teutonic spirit has infected Europe. I mean, think about that. I mean, the Nazis must have been horrified by that statement. And it's interesting that Nietzsche actually had a lot of positive things to say about the Jews. I mean, right. Nietzsche had a very negative attitude towards religion and therefore to Judaism and Christianity. But on many occasions in his later writings, Nietzsche says that the Jews they're strong, resilient people. They've overcome lots of challenges and lots of hardships and discrimination. And so he actually, and one of the reasons that Nietzsche actually came to dislike Wagner was because of Wagner's anti-Semitism.
Oh, that's a good reason, isn't it?
Yeah, and what in his later writings, Nietzsche actually attacks anti-Semitism very strong. And if you know a little bit about Nietzsche, his brother-in-law, his sister's husband, was a terrible anti-Semite. And Nietzsche never misses an opportunity to say nasty things about him and to say nasty things about anti-Semitism in general. So in some respects, he was almost philo-Semitic. He was on the side of the Jewish people against the rising anti-Semitism of late 19th century Germany. And yeah, you mentioned his enthusiasm for French culture. So much of Nietzsche's later years, after he retired from his professorship in Switzerland, he spent wandering through France and Switzerland and Italy. And in this regard, it's actually interesting if you look at the dedications to two of Nietzsche's early books. So his first major book was The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. of 1872. That was dedicated to Wagner, who was his mentor and his close friend at the time. When Nietzsche published his second book, which was his Untimely Meditations, he dedicated it to the memory of Voltaire, which I think must have outraged Wagner, because Wagner was a francophone. I mean, Wagner disliked the French almost as much as he disliked the Jews. So Nietzsche was there clearly trying to show his affiliation.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And there's also Goethe was also on good terms with the French, if I'm not mistaken. He spent a long time in the city of Strasbourg, which I think at the time was under German control, but it has a lot of people passing through from Germany to France, and he spoke French. I know that some of these love letters Goethe wrote in French to. I think was it the real Gretchen
that was a very early infatuation in Goethe's life. I think even sort of I think in some ways gave rise to his Sturm und Drang phase. That was probably around the time.
So when he was very, very passionately in love, he wrote a lot in French. So there's an interesting connection here, and a general connection to the objectivist movement's obsession with the French and Russian literature, and really to talk about, German Romanticism also has a connection to French Romanticism, but we must not remember where it all came from. So that's another good reason to attend your talk. Perhaps if we're here with you, Nicolas, we have to talk about some music. Of course. So what will be some good recommendations for our viewers, and perhaps some anecdotes, music related to Faust, good things to listen to in preparation for your talk, perhaps?
Well, the best starting point here is probably some of the songs by Franz Schubert. Schubert was a great admirer of Goethe's poetry, and he actually set several of the songs from Faust Part 1, most notably some of the songs of Gretchen, or Margaret. She's the sweet, innocent young girl who is seduced and later on abandoned by Faust in Part 1 of the tragedy. And she has a number of notable songs. There's this one of the first scenes where we meet her, she has the ballad of the King of Thule, who is this king who is faithful to his loved one unto the grave. It's a very, very beautiful poem. There's also the famous scene known as in German as Gretchen am Spinnrade, Gretchen at the spinning wheel. And this is after her first encounter with Faust, where she's intrigued by him, and she notices that he is interested in her, and she's fascinated by him, by his bearing, his gait, his learning, the touch of his hand clasp, and everything. And so she sings this song at the spinning wheel. That's one of Schubert's most famous songs. It's definitely one that's worth knowing. And then later on, after Gretchen has been abandoned by Faust and she's pregnant, she's with child by him, there's this scene where she's praying in front of an image of the Mater Dolorosa, the sorrowful mother, the mother of Christ. And that's also been set to music by Schubert. Just a few other composers. I'll limit myself to settings of Goethe in German, because there's also French versions and Italian versions, operatic versions, but just sticking with German adaptations. There's actually an overture by Wagner called the Faust Overture. This was written during a very bad period in Wagner's life. His first trip to Paris, right around 1840, where he spent 2.5 years of absolute poverty and misery, trying to promote himself as a composer, absolutely failing to get any toehold in the establishment. At that time, Wagner had planned to write a symphony inspired by Faust, but he only ended up writing a single piece, a single movement, which is known as the Faust Overture. It's a very good piece. And if you're familiar with Wagner's opera Der Fliegende Holländer, The Flying Dutchman, they were written around the same time. And I think that there's some interesting similarities between the Flying Dutchman Overture on the one hand and this Faust Overture. They were written around the same time, and there's some interesting points of connection between them. It's actually one of Wagner's darkest works. It's inspired by... Well, it's meant to be a kind of a character portrait of Faust when we first see him, when he's very malevolent and he sees no meaning to life. And it's a period of it was composed during a period of Wagner's life where I think he could identify with what Faust was experiencing at the beginning of part one of Goethe's dramas. Now, I think one of the absolute best musical embodiments of Faust comes from Robert Schumann, who around 1850 composed a large-scale work, one of his most ambitious work, called Scenes from Goethe's Faust, for solo voices, chorus, and orchestra. And it's a setting of 7 scenes, some from Faust Part 1 and some from Faust Part 2. So he includes, for example, the scene of Faust and Gretchen in the garden, Gretchen before the image of the Mater Dolorosa, Gretchen praying in church. And then he includes various scenes from Part 2, including the very, very end, the very last scene, which is the transfiguration of Faust's soul, what you might call the ascension of Faust into heaven. He's one of the few composers who's actually set this scene in his entirety. One last thing I'm going to mention, Gustav Mahler, great Austrian composer of songs and symphonies. Gustav Mahler's Symphony No. 8 is a very unusual work. It's an extraordinary work. It's in 2 parts. The first part is a setting of a Latin hymn called the Veni Creator Spiritus. But the second part of the symphony is a large-scale setting of the final scene from Faust Part 2. The very same scene with which Robert Schumann had completed his scenes from Goethe's Faust. If you're interested in exploring Faust in music, that will give you lots to work with. So Schubert, Wagner, Schumann, Mahler, those 4 in particular, my top recommendations.
There's also, I think, a very famous one by Liszt, right?
Ah, yes. Well, yeah, we should mention, so Franz Liszt wrote a Faust symphony in 3 movements. Now, in 1848, Liszt settled in the town of Weimar. He'd been traveling for a decade. He'd been a touring virtuoso, crisscrossing the height and breadth and width of Europe as a pianist, as a concert pianist. And in 1848, he decided enough is enough. I want to settle down and just stay in one place. So he settled in Weimar. And Weimar, of course, that's the city of Goethe and Schiller. And around that time was the centenary of Goethe's birth, because Goethe was born in 1749. So the 1849, there were all sorts of celebrations. And you've probably heard of the English novelist George Eliot. She and her partner came to Weimar for the Goethe centenary. They stayed with Liszt and they befriended Liszt. And I think it was actually, it might have been George Eliot or it might have been her partner who suggested to Liszt the idea of a musical work inspired by Goethe, specifically inspired by Faust. The Faust Symphony, I have to say, is one of Liszt's most extraordinary works. It's a really amazing and beautiful work. It's in 3 movements, and each movement is a portrait of one of the main characters. So the first movement is a character portrait of Faust, and the themes of the symphony represent different aspects of Faust. Faust as a scholar, Faust as a lover, Faust as a man of aspiration and striving, all these different aspects of Faust. The second movement is Gretchen, her sweetness, her innocence, her pure love towards Faust. And then the third and the most remarkable movement is Mephistopheles. Now, the interesting thing about Mephistopheles is he has no themes of his own. What Liszt does is he takes all of the Faust themes from the first movement and he twists them, corrupts them, tortures them into a kind of a comical or sarcastic form to represent Mephistopheles as nihilism.
That's very interesting.
Mephistopheles first introduces himself to us by saying, I am the spirit of negation. Ich bin der Geist, der steht für Nichts. I am the spirit of negation. So he doesn't create anything. He just takes Faust's themes and puts them through the ringer, so to speak. It's a really original and extraordinary piece.
That's really, really interesting. I think it's a wonderful, very profound understanding of the nature of evil. That evil doesn't create, it only destroys, and it relies on the sanction of the good, people like Faust, in order for it to exist. and that's a point that Ayn Rand famously, I wish famously to us made. So that's really interesting. I don't know how often do you hear such a profound commentary on the nature of evil, and you find that on Faust as well. Just a good example for the philosophical depth.
Yeah, I'll mention very quickly that Goethe puts an interesting twist on this idea, because Mephistopheles is a spirit who wills to do evil, but actually ends up doing good. That's something I'll elaborate on a little bit in my talk. So I'm just throwing that out there as a teaser for you.
Great teaser. Can't wait to go and watch this great talks of yours. Okay, I think it's a wonderful way to wrap it up, Nicolas. We threw a lot of interesting teasers, and I think, again, I encourage everyone to attend the talk. If you're watching this after the talk, which is going to be in this coming June, which date do you remember? 16th, 15th, something like that. Your talk would be.
I'm on the Tuesday morning, which is that's the 18th, Tuesday the 18th.
Tuesday, June the 18th. If you're watching this in a year on YouTube, hopefully we will put the link in the description for your great talk in retrospective. So any final things you want to add, Nicolas?
If you haven't had a chance to see my Wagner talk from last year, check that out. I think we said we were going to put the link in the description. And if you're coming to the conference, please come up and introduce yourselves and say hello. I'd love to chat about culture or art or anything else. Look forward to meeting as many members of your audience as possible.
Fantastic. Me too, by the way. It'll be fantastic to meet some of the viewers at OCON. I'm going to spend a week there. It's going to be great. Nicolas Krusek, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. As always, it is. Thank you for illuminating us with all of this wonderful European tour of great works of literature. We've been to Germany, we've been to Austria, Switzerland, France. Amazing, isn't it?
And ancient Greece.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I will see you, my viewers, in the next installment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.